Since March 19, 1979, C-SPAN, a public service funded by the cable television industry, began giving you direct access to government in an innovative way by putting you, the viewer, into the rooms where politics is debated and policies are determined. C-SPAN began as a bold initiative. Now, 45 years later, we are essential for those wanting to see democracy at work, without editing or commentary. With continued cable support, we've done this without a dime of government funding, maintaining our independence. As we mark 45 years, the business of media is rapidly changing, and now your support is crucial for our mission's future. Support our legacy of unfiltered access by donating today at cspan.org/donate.
Já parou para pensar em como seria ouvir esse podcast no seu carro com outra categoria de tecnologia e conectividade? Só o novo Hyundai HB20 te possibilita isso, porque ele é outra categoria de carro. Então garanta já o seu, porque tem ofertas com versões a partir de R$ 75.990, podendo usar o seu usado na troca. Últimas unidades, hein? Corra até uma concessionária Hyundai e faça seu test drive. Paz no trânsito? Começa por você.
This week, 2024 campaign trail was with President Biden as he was on the road in Florida and Virginia, and with Vice President Harris as she campaigned in Wisconsin, and with former President Trump as he met with voters in Manhattan en route to one of his criminal trials. Also, the latest on U.S. House and Senate races, including the race to replace retiring Senator Ben Cardin in Maryland. But first, a look at the latest polls, all showing the Democratic and GOP presumptive presidential nominees in a dead heat. The latest Morning Consult poll had President Biden and former President Trump virtually tied at 44% and 43%, and a Quinnipiac University poll had them both at 46%. Quinnipiac also asked voters who they'd vote for with independent and third-party options. That left the two major party candidates tied at 37%, with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. at 16%. A later poll from YouGov and The Economist had Biden and Trump tied at 43% apiece, with Kennedy taking just 3%. Next, a look at local coverage from North Carolina, where former President Trump was forced to cancel his only planned campaign event last weekend.
Well, a day after the jury was seated in his New York hush money trial, former President Donald Trump was scheduled to speak at a campaign rally in Wilmington tonight. However, due to the weather, the event was canceled just 25 minutes before Trump was expected to take the stage. WRAL's Heidi Kirk spoke with supporters about their big disappointment.
There was barely room to walk here in this parking lot with the amount of people parked here for former President Donald Trump's rally here in Wilmington. Now take a listen. You won't hear anything except the faint drizzle of rain that canceled that event.
Let this sink in. It's the moment lightning strikes just before Donald Trump's booming voice takes over, 30 minutes ahead of his scheduled remarks.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is Donald Trump, your favorite president of all time, hopefully.
Postponing his first rally in North Carolina since the start of his historic criminal trial.
They've asked us to ask people to leave the site and seek shelter.
A message causing crowds to split from the storms.
This rally, it's going to be historical. Well, it was going to be historical.
The former president pledged to reschedule his rally in Wilmington, same location, at a different time.
I'm so sorry, but we'll do it again, and we'll do it bigger and better. And you have my promise.
Bob and Nicole Tempestelli traveled here from New York.
And we're so disappointed that we won't be able to see him tonight. We waited for 4 hours at least, 5 hours.
But judging from the sky,
it's not looking good. It was probably best that they canceled it.
Now, the former president has not mentioned a new date or time for this rally, but we'll continue to keep you updated as soon as we know a time and a place.
Former President Trump was able to meet with voters in New York City, however, as he was en route to Day 7 of his criminal trial on charges related to a hush money payment to adult film star Stormy Daniels. Among those he met, members of a local steam fitters union, whose president told Fox News the former president was getting more than 75% support from his membership.
Support. I hear the Teamsters, I've done a lot of work with Teamsters. I built a lot of buildings with the Teamsters, and they like me, a lot of Teamsters here. And it's an amazing show of affection, but we did a great job. I think these may be more Democrats, but for me they're Republicans. There's not a Democrat in there. These are people. Look at that building. Look what we can do. We built a lot of great buildings in this city with these people, and they've given me great support. They're really amazing. They're very, very talented people. They don't get the credit for it. They have very few people can do what they do. We used to do 3 floors a week in concrete, and it was guys like this that did it. So it's very amazing.
Did you know about the?
No, he's been very nice. David's been very nice. He's a nice guy.
Did you know, Mr. President? Did you know?
What's that? Well, we have a big case today. This judge isn't allowing me to go. We have a big case today in the Supreme Court on presidential immunity. A president has to have immunity. If you don't have immunity, you just have a ceremonial president. You won't have immunity.
Did you know about the payments?
So we have a big, very big case going.
Did you know about the payment?
Very talented people. They're very smart. They know what to do. They're going to be very good.
Did you know about the payment to Cheney?
President Biden and Vice President Harris were also out meeting with voters this week. Next, highlights from Vice President Harris's visit to the swing state of Wisconsin and some of President Biden's Earth Day remarks from a stop in Virginia.
I believe freedom is fundamental to the promise of America. The promise of America is the promise of protecting and respecting individuals' rights and liberty and freedom to make certain decisions, including those of heart and home. And what we know is that, sadly, almost 2 years ago now, the highest court in our land, the Court of Thurgood and RBG, took a constitutional right that had been recognized from the people of America, from the women of America. And thereafter, in state after state, we've been seeing laws proposed and passed that would criminalize healthcare providers. In some states, providing prison for life for doctors and nurses who simply provide health care. Laws being proposed and passed that make no exception even for rape and incest. When we think about what is at stake, it is absolutely about freedom. You know, we talk about democracy. Well, let's think about it. I think of democracy as having basically, there's a duality to the nature of it. On the one hand, incredible strength. When a democracy is intact, the strength it has in terms of what it does to protect its people and protect individual rights and freedoms, when intact, it is also very fragile. It is only as strong as our willingness to fight for it. And so fight we will, and fight we must. And here's the thing, when we fight, we win. We have 197 days to go, which is kind of a long time, but really a short amount of time. And there's a lot we can get done. And I know I'm preaching to the choir here. Elections can be fun. You know, one of the things that I love about yes, think about it. But think about it. I don't know if the person you're sitting next to right now you've met before or not, but what I love about campaigns, you get to meet people that you may have never met before who all come together because we care. And we understand what's at stake, and we understand the power of the collective, and we remember that we're not in it alone, we're all in it together. And so let's think about these next 197 days, yes, 197 days, in a way that we remind ourselves that this is what the strength of our country looks like. It's about everybody staying engaged and involved. It's about remembering that the sign of real leadership is based not on who you beat down, but on who you lift up. That real leadership, right, is about looking at someone and knowing that the character is about the kind of character that has some level of compassion and concern and care about the struggles of other people and then takes it upon themselves to do something about it. And that's what we are then, a room of leaders who care and are willing to get engaged. And so in this process, Wisconsin, I say let's reelect Tammy Baldwin to the United States Senate, Pocan to the Congress, and Joe and me to the White House.
Today, I'm proud to announce that Americans across the country can now apply to become the first members of the American Climate Corps. We're recruiting for over 2,000 positions in 36 states to start with in Washington, D.C., Puerto Rico, with many on the way. Just go to Climate Corps, as mentioned already, climatecorps.gov to apply. You'll get paid to fight climate change, learning how to install those solar panels, fight wildfires, rebuild wetlands, weatherize homes, and so much more that's going to protect the environment and build a clean energy economy. To ensure a pathway to good union jobs and careers, you'll have access to free apprenticeship training through a new partnership we're announcing today with the North American Building Trade Unions. And as you may remember, when I announced in 2020, I initially didn't announce my climate position until I talked to the unions, because unions were all, they thought climate cost them jobs. Well, guess what? IBW stepped up, and they all stepped up, and now our strongest support comes from unions. When you finish your service, you finish your term of service, you'll also be eligible for a streamlined path to federal government jobs related to climate and clean energy. We're also announcing a new collaboration with Bloomberg Philanthropies that puts American Climate Corps members in energy communities like former coal mining and communities, power plant communities that have powered our nation but have been fence line communities and hurt very badly for generations. Today's announcement builds upon an unprecedented historic action we've already taken to tackle the climate crisis, deliver environmental justice, and build a clean energy future.
Independent presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy Jr. released a new ad this week highlighting his pro-marijuana legalization stance, something he's highlighted on the campaign trail since last year. Next, that new ad, which featured part of his recent appearance on C-SPAN's Washington Journal.
My question to you is about marijuana.
A quarter of people in our jails in our country are people who are there for minor drug crimes, many of them for marijuana, which is now legal in many states. What I've advocated is that we should legalize marijuana. We should have a federal tax on the marijuana that is designated specifically for drug treatment and rehabilitation. And I want to build, as part of my presidency, a series of renewal centers, of detoxification, essentially, centers around this country to treat the rise in mental illness and PTSD and drug addiction that is debilitating our children. We lost 106,000 kids last year to overdoses. In the opioid overdoses, that is double the number of kids that we lost during the 20-year Vietnam War. We need to start healing our country in many ways. I think the best solution is to legalize it, make it possible for the cannabis distributors to actually bank their profits and their revenues and not force them to keep them in mattresses, which encourages more crime, and then tax it robustly so that we can pay for these, for the addiction treatment for our children.
Next, some of our Washington Journal conversation with Cook Political Report founder Charlie Cook, taking a look at the state of the race for control of the U.S. House and Senate.
Where does the battle for the Senate stand right now?
Sure. The Senate and the House are very different animals. In the House, all 435 seats are up every 2 years, so it's all the same thing. But the Senate, only a third's up every 2 years, and it matters which third, and it matters what happens 6 or 12 years earlier. If a party has a really great year, 6 years later, they may be overexposed. Well, this is a really bad map for Democrats because they have basically 9 seats that are more vulnerable than the most vulnerable Republican seats. And it's a unfortunate situation for them. They're defending 3 seats that are up in states that Donald Trump carried twice, Ohio, Montana, and West Virginia, and then 4 more that he carried back in 2016, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Arizona. So Democrats are playing defense right now. They can't have anything go wrong without losing control of the Senate.
You wrote a piece recently that said, rather than asking if the Democrats could lose control of the Senate, the better question is what the Republicans' majority could look like. So what could that look like?
Yeah, it's I hate saying that, but given that West Virginia, where Joe Manchin is retiring, given that seat will turn over, that's 50-50. So if Trump wins, they don't have to lose any. They can go 7-0 or 9-0 for vulnerable Republican seats and still lose their majority. But I think if Democrats can get out of this with losing only 2 or 3 seats, they'd be really pretty lucky. We've seen years where parties have lost 7, 8, 9 or more. Lost in 1980, lost 12 seats. So this could be a horrible night for Democrats. It could be just kind of a sort of bad, but it's pretty unlikely it'll be a great one for them in the Senate.
One of the seats you talked about was Jon Tester in Montana. He is seeking his 4th term, and NPR has an article. The headline is that he's pitching his usual moderate message as he's seeking re-election. Does that moderate position still work for him in Montana?
Well, it's worked well. The question is, does it work well enough? I mean, the analogy I use, and this would apply for Sherrod Brown in Ohio as well, is you could be an Olympic gold medal swimmer, but if the undertow is great enough, even you could get pulled under. And I think Jon Tester and Sherrod Brown are the only Democrats that could possibly win statewide in their states. But the question is how many, for Tester, how many Trump voters does he need to convince to vote for him as well? Or for Sherrod Brown, how many Trump voters for Brown? Because we're not seeing a whole lot of ticket splitting anymore. In fact, Pew Research Center's figured out that since 2012, 91% of Senate races are won by the party that's carrying that state either that night or 2 years earlier. In 2016, all 34 Senate races went exactly the same way they were going presidentially. In 2022, it was all but Susan Collins. In 2020, it was all but Susan Collins. In 22, it was all but Ron Johnson. So we're nationalized in our voting now.
We're still several months away from the election, but are you seeing any of that right now from last election carry over, where that seems to be kind of following that same trend for this year?
Yeah, well, it's too early to say, because I think the defining thing for Republicans in 2022 that made the night not what it should have been was that they nominated in about 24 key races around the country some pretty exotic candidates that, well, let's just face it, if Republicans had nominated a potted plant, they'd have done better than whoever it was that they nominated. And there were about 4 Senate races and 4 governor's races and, Attorney General, Secretary of State, and about 8 or 10 congressional races where Republicans just nominated the wrong people. Well, it's too early to know where, who's going to come out of all these primaries. So it's too early to say whether it'll be the same dynamic or not.
So only a third of Senate seats up, but all of those House races are up for re-election. What do those look like right now? What are you watching?
Well, I think it's going to be, you think of coming out of 2020, you had a half dozen seat Democratic margin. They lost seats but held on by a half dozen seats. 2022, Republicans got a majority, but they only held on by a half dozen seats. In this election, there are more Republican seats in districts that Trump won than, more Republican seats in districts that Biden won, like I think 17, versus Democratic seats in seats that Trump won. So, but I'd call it a draw. It's going to be within a handful of seats one way or the other, most likely.
Former House January 6th Committee co-chair Liz Cheney was a guest speaker at Georgetown University, where she was in conversation with author and historian John Meacham. During her remarks, she talked about David McCormick, the Pennsylvania Republican, who this week won his party's primary for the state's U.S. Senate race against Democratic incumbent Bob Casey.
The Republican candidate for Senate in Pennsylvania is a man named Dave McCormick, who served honorably, served in the military, served the nation honorably, who served in both, I believe, the Bush administration and the Trump administration. He knows better. He knows that Donald Trump is not fit for office. And yet, in the last 24 hours, he has been circulating an endorsement that Donald Trump made of him. Donald Trump was standing in the hallway outside the courtroom in New York, and he endorsed McCormick. And McCormick is now circulating that endorsement, which, that sort of behavior from somebody who absolutely knows better creates a permission structure for people to support the former president. And I think that everyone who has taken an oath to the Constitution, everyone who wants to serve in public office, has to be willing to say, no, that this is wrong. It's not about policy. This is wrong, and it's a threat to the Constitution.
The latest poll in the Pennsylvania U.S. Senate race has the Democratic incumbent, Senator Bob Casey, up 13 points, according to the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Next, the latest ads from both of the party nominees in the Keystone States Senate contest.
They hope you won't notice. CEOs sneak around, downsize favorite brands, charging more for less. Same packaging, smaller box, familiar logo, fewer servings. I'm Bob Casey. I call it shrinkflation. My plan gives the Federal Trade Commission the power to punish corporate price gouging. And let's roll back their huge tax breaks to put more money where it belongs, in your pocket. That's why I approve this message.
6 minutes. It's all you get. Sometimes it's all you can take. On the wrestling mat, there's no place to hide. I'm Dave McCormick. Wrestling is in the bloodstream of Pennsylvania. The toughness, the grit, the resilience, the independence that you see on that wrestling mat, you see in those high school gymnasiums all across Pennsylvania. To me, that really represents the best of Pennsylvania. When I look at what's going on in the country, I see all these intractable problems, and I think more than anything else, we need leadership. And the thing that I learned on the wrestling mat in college at Army was that leadership is about toughness, it's about resilience, it's about making hard choices, it's about attacking hard problems, and that's what we're not doing in America today. So I think there's something to be learned on the wrestling mats here in Pennsylvania about the kind of leadership we need to take the country back. I'm Dave McCormick. I'm running for the Senate to make the hard calls.
Democrat Ben Cardin is retiring from the U.S. Senate after 3 terms, and here to talk about the race to replace him is John O'Connor, the political editor at the Baltimore Banner. John, who's running against each other on the Democratic side?
So it's a fairly large field, but it really comes down to about 2 candidates. We have David Trone, who is currently represents a district in the U.S. House that includes Montgomery County and the western part of the state, the Panhandle. He's the billionaire founder and executive from Total Wine and More. You may recognize that company. He's running against Prince George's County executive Angela Also Brooks. She's in her 2nd term in one of Maryland's largest counties, and the race really is basically between the 2 of them. Trone is bringing a lot of his personal financial fortune to the race, and Angela Also Brooks is bringing a lot of the Maryland political establishment to the race.
Has there been any polling in the race?
Yeah, polling has been fairly consistent. We did a poll here at the Banner a couple of weeks ago. It found Trone holding, an 8-point lead or so. So kind of within the margin of error technically, but it seems like he's got a lead. Polling has been fairly consistent there, showing him somewhere 6 to 10 points in the lead over Also Brooks in the primary. The interesting dynamic here is that most likely waiting in the general election is former Republican Governor Larry Hogan. And so there's been a lot of polling too, testing Hogan against these 2 candidates. So that's having, I think, some influence in the conversation about support for the primary.
Between these 2 Democrats, is one of them ahead on fundraising?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, depends on how you want to call fundraising, right? Trone has sunk more than $40 million of his own money into the race. He has spent a large part of that. It is very difficult to turn on the television, go on the internet, watch your favorite streamer and not see a Trone commercial. They are everywhere. Also, Brooks is also raising a pretty good amount of money when it, by Maryland Senate race standards. But she's just getting swamped right now because it's difficult to compete with that kind of money.
And you mentioned former Governor Larry Hogan. A lot of C-SPAN viewers might recognize him from his days as governor and his flirtation with the Republican presidential nomination. When did he get into the race, and how has that changed the trajectory of it?
Yes, he got into the race on the very last day possible. On filing day, we got something of a surprise announcement that Hogan was going to enter the race. Apparently, it's been reported elsewhere that national Republicans had been kind of courting him in those last few days running up to the filing deadline and convinced him to get in. He had said many times he wasn't interested in running for Senate, that he didn't want to be in a legislative body after serving as an executive, but decided to jump in at the last minute. It has completely changed the race. So typically Maryland federal races are decided after the primary. The state voter registration is roughly half Democratic, about a quarter Republican, and then about a quarter independents and third parties. So Democrats have a significant numbers advantage here. It's been quite a while since a Republican has won a statewide federal race. It was the 80s was the last time. And so Hogan has made, in some ways, a bipartisan kind of 3-way primary because he's certainly upended the Democratic primary in that those 2 candidates are now positioning themselves against who is the better candidate to run in the general election, as well as trying to convince Democratic voters, I hew most closely to your views and these issues that you think are important.
And tell our viewers just how popular Larry Hogan was as a red governor of a relatively blue state.
Yeah, he was both popular and it was enduring. the last several years of his tenure, the number was fairly consistent. He was about 70% job approval here in Maryland. He was more popular among Democrats than he was among Republicans. National Democrats and Maryland Democrats are going to want to nationalize this race as much as possible. Whereas so far, Larry Hogan is kind of campaigning as like a third term for governor, even though he's going to serve in the Senate. So Democrats are definitely going to want to point towards abortion as an issue. Maryland, it's that we have a law protecting the right to abortion. There's going to be a constitutional ballot amendment question on the ballot this year. But Democrats are going to make the argument that if Larry Hogan is elected to the Senate, potentially a national ban is in play. Likewise, they're going to say that Hogan joining the Senate helps support Republican positions on a number of issues that maybe Hogan doesn't hold himself. So, that could be the renewing the tax cuts, the Trump administration tax cuts that are going to be up again. That could be, the future of the Affordable Care Act. It could be a lot of different issues that Democrats are going to use the positions of national Republicans to try and drive down support for Hogan.
John O'Connor, political editor at the Baltimore Banner. Thanks so much for your time and expertise.
Thanks for having me.
Last, a look at highlights from the recent Candidates Forum WBFF TV in Baltimore, hosted between the two top Democratic U.S. Senate candidates in Maryland.
What's the federal government's role in the larger conversation when it comes to public transit, and how would you ensure accountability and oversight for the federal dollars that would be coming to regions like Baltimore City to ensure that the projects don't balloon and we actually see results?
Well, first of all, we have to recognize and pay respect to the 6 workers that lost their lives, and often we demonize immigrants, but these folks are some of the greatest Americans that are working really hard for our country, day, in this case, night. Then we got to support the longshoremen and all the other folks that are there working, have lost their jobs. They've got no job. Boom, zero, gone. We've got to get them full pay. Unemployment of $430 a week is not enough. We've got to get them back to what their pay was prior to this. Then, of course, we've got to get this bridge built as quickly as we can. And we got to be focused on that. I'm an appropriator in the Appropriations Committee. We're going to get the money. We're going to make that happen.
What I can tell you is in rebuilding that bridge, it's going to be very important to not only get the infrastructure dollars that are going to be necessary to build the bridge, but to make sure that we are securing the jobs of the 15,000 individuals who have been impacted, as well as getting small business loans to the businesses who have been impacted. Listen, I'm the only person in this race who has the experience of not voting is just one part. There are people in Washington who think voting is all of it. But I've been able to not only get the funding, but to turn that funding into real infrastructure. I have built schools, I have built hospitals, I've built roads, and it's important to implement the funding even after you get it.
Both of you have made similar comments about abortion rights and access, but now the conversation seems to be turning to the future of in vitro fertilization, or IVF. Do you believe the federal government has a role in regulating IVF nationally? And if so, how would you work with other members in the Senate to get your view accomplished?
There's no role for the federal government to moderate and regulate a woman's health choices. These are the choice between a woman and her doctor, and no one else should be involved in that. Certainly no person in the political spectrum. Absolutely not. So we've got to work instead to open up freedom so people have that choice, and we can get Roe v. Wade recodified as the law of the land.
Well, I can tell you that this issue is a very personal one to me. As the mother of an 18-year-old daughter, I believe so firmly that the privacy and freedom that women deserve to make their own decisions about their bodies belong to a woman and a woman only. It is so outrageous that we are at a time where it is not only abortion rights that are under attack, but we see now that these Republicans just won't stop. Their reproductive rights are on the ballot. That we see also when we see IVF, we see that in Arizona now we have Republicans who want to charge a woman with a crime and incarcerate her. Women deserve to choose abortion rights, reproductive rights, IVF, it all belongs to the woman. I've spent the last 27 years in public service because I believe that public service is the highest calling. As state's attorney, I oversaw a 50% cut in violence while I was state's attorney. And as county executive, I have built schools. I've built mental health care facilities. I've invested not only in health care, but in economic opportunity for all of our families, making sure that all of us have the opportunity not only to develop generational wealth, but to have high wages. I will continue to fight for you. I ask you for your vote every single day and every single evening. I know what I'm fighting for. I know who I'm fighting for and what we're fighting about. And I will continue to fight for all of Maryland's families and preserve our democracy.
Congressman Trone.
It's going to be tough to raise taxes on those big companies when you're taking all their dollars. That's a challenge. My background is I started off on a farm, 200 acres. We had no indoor plumbing. We had an outhouse. At 28, my dad was an abusive alcoholic. Our farm failed. We went bankrupt. We lost everything. I started over with my mom and younger siblings and built a business and lived the American dream. I've been so fortunate, so lucky. Now I have a chance to be a public servant and give back, work in addiction, work in mental health, work in the systemic racism we have in our country, work in education that's so important, climate change, medical research. But at the same time, I've also been given a second chance as a cancer survivor. I'm still here, and I'm here to be able to make big changes and not owe anybody to make those changes, and I can beat Hogan.
A reminder, this program and all of C-SPAN's campaign 2024 coverage can be found online at cspan.org/campaign.